One of the biggest misconceptions about love, especially when it comes to avoidant personalities, is that if they're quiet or emotionally distant, they must not care. That couldn't be further from the truth. What many people don't realize is that for an avoidant, love doesn't begin with excitement or fireworks. It begins with safety, emotional safety. That's the key that unlocks everything else. When an avoidant starts to feel emotionally safe with someone, it marks a profound internal shift. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's subtle, but it's real. You'll see it not in their words, but in their choices. They begin to stay. They start to regulate instead of run. They choose to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. This might seem small on the surface, but psychologically, this is massive. You are witnessing a person who has built their entire life around self-protection, learning to lower their armor. That's not just affection, that's transformation. You see, avoidants aren't cold or heartless. They've just learned, often very early in life, that closeness equals pain. Maybe their needs were ignored, maybe love came with strings attached, maybe they were told, explicitly or through experience, that emotions make you weak. So they built emotional distance as a survival strategy. It became their identity. And when they meet someone who genuinely sees them, who doesn't chase or control or shame them for needing space, something remarkable happens. Their nervous system starts to relax. That's what emotional safety does. It creates room for authenticity. It allows love to exist without threat. The avoidant starts to realize that they can be close without losing themselves. They can share a thought, a story, a vulnerability, and the world doesn't fall apart. They begin to experience intimacy not as suffocation, but as grounding. And that's when love, real love, begins to take root. Now, here's what most people miss. This shift doesn't look romantic at first. It's not the sudden text messages or big confessions. It's micro moments. The way they linger a bit longer before leaving, the softness in their tone when they speak, the effort they make to explain rather than withdraw. It's them reaching out when they usually wouldn't. It's them staying in the room during conflict instead of shutting down. Those are the signs of love you can't see on the surface, but they're there, and they mean everything. When an avoidant starts to feel safe, they begin to develop what psychologists call earned security. This is when someone, through consistent emotional safety, learns to rewire their attachment patterns. It's not that they stop being avoidant. It's that they stop acting out of fear. They start making choices from love, not self-preservation. And that's why safety is more important than passion. Passion burns hot and fast. Safety builds trust and permanence. What's fascinating here is that this mirrors a philosophical truth. Real love is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to face it. The avoidant feels love deeply, but love terrifies them because it threatens the illusion of control. Yet, when they stay, when they lean in despite that fear, they're doing something incredibly brave. They're choosing connection over avoidance, vulnerability over comfort, truth over protection. That's what authentic love looks like from the inside out. If you've ever been close to an avoidant, this is the moment you start to see their heart peek through the cracks. You might notice they begin to ask questions they never used to ask about your feelings, your day, your dreams. You might notice they look at you longer, not because they're studying you, but because they're finally present. They're starting to trust not just you, but the safety they feel in your presence. And that's when everything changes. But make no mistake, this doesn't happen because you chase them, fix them, or convince them. It happens because you create space where honesty feels safe. You embody calm instead of chaos. You show consistency instead of confusion. That's how you teach an avoidant that love doesn't have to mean loss. This is where the healing happens, not in forcing them to open up, but in letting them feel safe enough to choose to. When you give an avoidant the gift of emotional safety, you're not just earning their trust, you're helping them rediscover their capacity to love. You're showing them that intimacy doesn't have to cost them their freedom. It can actually enhance it. And here's the deeper truth. Love that grows from safety lasts longer than love that grows from spark. Because once an avoidant learns they can be themselves without judgment, without pressure, and without fear, that love becomes real. It's grounded, it's stable, it's alive. So if you ever wonder whether an avoidant truly loves you, look for the shift, not in what they say, but in what they allow. Watch how they start staying when things get real. Notice how they let you in piece by piece. That's not hesitation, that's courage. Because for an avoidant, love isn't about losing control. It's about finally feeling safe enough to let someone see them. And that, right there, is what authentic love looks like, when safety becomes the bridge between fear and connection. Consistency, let's talk about it. Because when it comes to avoidant personalities, this is where you'll see one of the most powerful signs of real love. You see, an avoidant's natural rhythm in relationships is inconsistency. They pull close, then they pull away. They express interest, then disappear. They crave connection, but when it starts to feel too real, they run. That push and pull dynamic isn't about manipulation. It's about fear. Fear of being consumed, fear of being trapped, fear of losing autonomy. So when an avoidant begins to replace confusion with consistency, that's not just progress. That's a revolution in their inner world. Because consistency, for them, means safety. It means they've started to associate your presence not with threat, but with stability. They no longer see you as someone who might invade their space or demand more than they can give. Instead, they see you as a calm presence, a steady rhythm in a life that's often been filled with unpredictable emotional storms. Now, here's the thing about avoidance. Most of them grew up in environments where emotional consistency didn't exist. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe affection was given, then taken away. Maybe the people who were supposed to be safe weren't safe at all. Over time, inconsistency became normal to them. It trained their nervous system to expect instability. So when they finally meet someone who shows up the same way, day after day, emotionally grounded and predictable, it doesn't just feel different. It feels foreign. And because it's foreign, their first instinct is to resist it. That's why you'll often see avoidants test consistency. They'll pull back to see if you'll chase. They'll go quiet to see if you'll panic, not because they're trying to play games, but because they're asking a deeper question. Can I trust this? Will it last? They've been conditioned to believe that connection comes with cost, so they need evidence that this new kind of love, steady, calm, consistent, isn't an illusion. And that's where the shift happens. When they realize your energy doesn't change based on their distance. When you don't spiral every time they need space. When you keep showing up in a way that's emotionally stable and grounded. That's when their nervous system starts to calm. That's when they begin to reach out, not because they have to, but because they want to. That's when love begins to look like reliability, not risk. This is the moment when an avoidant begins to transform. They move from being reactive to being intentional. They start returning your calls instead of avoiding them. They check in, they initiate, they participate. And most importantly, they begin to do so consistently. not just in moments of guilt or loneliness, but as a natural part of connection. Their actions start aligning with their words. Psychologically, that's massive. It means they're starting to integrate emotional security. They're no longer using distance as a defense mechanism. They're learning that closeness doesn't have to equal chaos. They start to internalize that love doesn't have to threaten their independence. It can actually strengthen it. They begin to see you not as a disruptor, but as a partner in peace. Now, let's be real. This process takes time. Consistency doesn't just appear one day. It's built moment by moment through hundreds of small, almost invisible decisions. Every time the avoidant chooses to stay in the conversation instead of shutting down, that's consistency. Every time they respond instead of withdraw, that's consistency. Every time they tell you how they feel, even awkwardly, that's consistency. And those moments add up. Slowly, they become the foundation of authentic connection. There's also a philosophical side to this. Consistency, at its core, is a declaration of value. It says, you matter enough for me to show up. And for someone who has spent their life believing that love is conditional, that's a radical message. When the avoidant becomes consistent, it's not because they've suddenly become secure. It's because they've finally found a reason to be. You've become the person worth staying steady for. That's what authentic love does. It gives meaning to the work of healing. But here's what's even deeper. When the avoidant becomes consistent, they start to experience love in a new way. Not as adrenaline, not as fear, but as presence. They begin to feel peace and connection instead of panic. But they learn that relationships don't have to be unpredictable to be real. And that realization, that calm can coexist with love, is life-changing. So, if you're wondering whether an avoidant truly loves you, pay attention to their rhythm. Are they beginning to show up more regularly? Are their actions starting to match their intentions? That's love taking form, not in grand gestures, but in quiet reliability, because real love doesn't live in the highs and lows. It lives in the middle, in the steady beat of consistency. And when an avoidant learns that rhythm, when they begin to replace confusion with clarity, they're not just falling in love with you. They're learning to love safely for the first time in their life. Consistency is love made visible. It's the quiet proof that fear is fading and trust is being built, one honest moment at a time. When an avoidant begins to let you see their inner world, that's when you know something real is happening. Because for someone with an avoidant attachment style, vulnerability is not natural, it's terrifying. Their instinct is to keep their emotions, their memories, and even their needs tightly locked away. They've spent years building emotional walls so high that even they can't always see over them. So when they start lowering those walls, when they start letting you in, that isn't a casual act. It's a sacred one. It means they're beginning to trust you in a way they rarely, if ever, have trusted anyone before. Now, to understand this, you have to look at the psychology behind avoidance. Most avoidants were not born distant. They became distant because, at some point, emotional openness cost them something. Maybe they were criticized for expressing feelings. Maybe their vulnerability was used against them. Maybe when they needed comfort, they were met with silence. Over time, they learned that needing people leads to disappointment. So they adapted. They taught themselves to appear self-reliant, to avoid relying on others, to feel safer alone than seen. That's why when they begin to open up, it's not just about sharing information. It's about sharing identity. You'll start to hear things like, I don't usually talk about this, or this is hard for me to say. Those sentences are gold. They're not filler. They're evidence of trust being built in real time. They're proof that their nervous system is finally starting to relax around you. And that is no small thing. It's fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Avoidants are often the ones who crave intimacy the most, but they fear it the deepest. They long to be known, but they're terrified that being known will lead to rejection. So when they do begin to share, what they're really doing is testing safety. They're saying, if I show you who I really am, will you still stay? That's where your response becomes crucial, because how you handle those moments determines how much deeper they'll go. If you meet their vulnerability with calm curiosity instead of emotional intensity, you signal to their nervous system that it's safe to keep opening. If you listen without trying to fix or analyze, you're telling them, you can be real here, and I won't punish you for it. That's how trust expands. Think about it. Most of us are used to love being performative. We overshare to connect. We force conversations. We try to pull emotional intimacy out of someone who's not ready. But real connection isn't pulled, it's allowed. When an avoidant starts opening up, they're doing something revolutionary for their emotional structure. They're choosing vulnerability over protection. That doesn't happen because you demanded it. It happens because they felt safe enough to choose it. And there's something profoundly philosophical about that. True love at its core is about being seen and still accepted. It's about being known not as an idealized version of yourself, but as your flawed, real, sometimes scared self. Avoidants often believe that their true selves are too much or too distant to be loved. So when they risk showing you that truth, it's their way of saying, I want you to see me, not just the version I let the world see. Here's where you'll notice the shift. They'll start to share their backstory, not just facts, but feelings. They'll talk about what shaped them. They'll express regrets, fears, or even small details of their inner experience that they never shared before. It may not come out perfectly. It might sound hesitant or detached, but pay attention to the effort. That's vulnerability trying to find its language again, and something beautiful happens after that. Once they share, and nothing bad happens, once they see that you don't leave, judge, or attack, they begin to rewire. Their brain starts to associate intimacy with safety, not danger. That's the foundation of emotional healing. They start to believe that connection doesn't have to end in loss. They begin to internalize a new truth. It's okay to let someone in. This process is slow, but it's real. You won't see it in grand declarations or romantic cliches. You'll see it in the way they start to look you in the eye when they talk. You'll see it in the way they share their thoughts before you ask. You'll see it in how they start including you in their world, inviting you into their routines, their plans, even their silence. When they start doing that, what they're really saying is, I trust you with me. And maybe that's the heart of it all, trust. Because for an avoidant, love is not measured in passion, it's measured in permission. Permission to see behind the armor. Permission to exist without performing. Permission to be loved without having to earn it. So if an avoidant ever starts letting you in, understand what that means. It's not just affection, it's faith. It's a deep, soul-level belief that maybe, just maybe, love can be safe this time. Because when an avoidant opens their world to you, they're not just sharing their story, they're inviting you into their healing. And that is the truest sign of authentic love there is. Love is easy to feel when everything's going right. But for an avoidant, the real test, the real proof of love, shows up when things get hard. Because avoidance, by its nature, is a pattern of escape. When emotions rise, when intimacy deepens, when conflict appears, the avoidant instinct is to pull away. Not because they don't care, but because closeness stirs up old fears, fears of being controlled, rejected, or engulfed. So, when an avoidant starts choosing to stay, when they begin to work through discomfort rather than retreat from it, that's not just growth. That's love in action. This is one of the most overlooked signs of authentic love from an avoidant partner. Most people misread withdrawal as indifference, but for someone who's spent their whole life equating closeness with loss, staying present through emotional tension is a radical act. It's the moment they begin rewriting their story. They're teaching themselves that they can be close and still safe, that they can disagree and still be loved, that they can be vulnerable and not lose control. What's happening here is more than behavioral change. It's psychological reconditioning. Avoidants are wired to protect themselves from perceived emotional threat. Their nervous system gets activated when intimacy deepens. The brain sends out danger signals that say, "You're about to lose yourself." But when love becomes genuine, when safety and trust begin to take root, they start to resist that instinct. They begin overriding their flight response with a new, conscious choice connection. You'll notice it in small ways first. Maybe they stay in the conversation instead of ghosting. Maybe they take a walk to clear their mind, but return instead of disappearing. Maybe they start expressing their feelings in awkward, fragmented sentences because they're trying, really trying, to communicate instead of shutting down. Those are the micro moments of courage that mark transformation, and they matter more than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Now, what's interesting about this stage is that it's where real emotional maturity begins to form. Because love, for all of us, not just avoidance, eventually becomes a choice, not a reflex. Early attraction is chemical, reactive, often impulsive. But authentic love requires awareness. It asks us to stay when our mind says run. It challenges our comfort zones. It demands self-awareness, accountability, and the ability to regulate our own emotions instead of projecting them onto someone else. For the avoidant, this is a deep, inner confrontation. They're not just learning to love someone else. They're learning to stop running from themselves. They're beginning to tolerate the sensations that used to terrify them: closeness, reliance, emotional exposure. They're discovering that intimacy isn't a threat to their autonomy. It's a mirror of their humanity. And when they start choosing to lean in instead of leaning out, they're not just connecting with you. They're reclaiming the parts of themselves they abandoned long ago. Philosophically, this is powerful because it touches on one of the core paradoxes of love, that real freedom doesn't come from avoidance, but from engagement. To love is to risk being changed by another person. It's to step into the unknown and trust that even if you lose your balance, you'll find your way back to yourself. The avoidant has spent years believing that self-protection equals strength, but authentic love reveals that true strength lies in presence, in staying through the storm instead of hiding from it. Now, it's important to recognize that staying doesn't mean staying in dysfunction. It doesn't mean ignoring your boundaries or accepting mistreatment. What it means is emotional availability, a willingness to work through the mess instead of shutting the door on it. When the avoidant starts to say things like, "I need space, but I'll come back," or "This is hard for me, but I want to figure it out," that's progress. That's growth. That's love in a form most people never get to see because they give up before it develops. And here's the deeper truth: when they choose to stay, it's not about you fixing them or proving your worth. It's about them trusting the process of connection. They've stopped fighting love as an external threat and started embracing it as an internal evolution. They're learning that intimacy doesn't have to mean enmeshment, that it's possible to be close and still free. The moment they make that choice consciously, to stay, to face the fear, to engage instead of escape, they cross a threshold. That's where authentic love lives. Not in perfection, but in persistence. Not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to move through it together. So if you ever find yourself doubting whether an avoidant truly loves you, look for the moments when they stay even when it's hard, when they communicate even through discomfort, when they choose growth over defense. Because that's not weakness. That's courage. That's transformation. And in those moments, remember this, for an avoidant, love isn't about never being afraid. It's about deciding that the connection is worth facing that fear for. Because authentic love isn't about running from pain. It's about standing still long enough to turn fear into trust. And when an avoidant chooses to stay, that's exactly what they're doing. One of the most misunderstood signs that an avoidant is falling in love is the way their emotional energy begins to shift. It's subtle but profound. When they start to mirror your calm instead of reacting to your chaos, it means something deep inside them has changed. Love for an avoidant doesn't show up in fireworks or grand emotional displays. It shows up in emotional regulation. It shows up in the quiet moments when they choose peace over panic, when they stop defending and start understanding, when they begin to match your emotional tone instead of resisting it. That's not just connection, that's evolution. Avoidants are not naturally calm in relationships. On the surface, they might appear composed, but internally, closeness feels threatening. Their emotional system is wired to interpret intimacy as instability. So when they fall in love, the first thing they have to confront isn't you, it's themselves. Their heart wants to connect, but their conditioning wants to retreat. They're constantly managing the tension between craving closeness and fearing it. But something powerful happens when they begin to feel safe. The nervous system, which has been trained to stay on alert, slowly relaxes. Their fight or flight response quiets down. They stop interpreting your emotions as danger signals. Instead of being reactive, they become responsive. Instead of pulling away when you're upset, they start listening. That's emotional growth in real time. When an avoidant mirrors your calm, it means they've stopped fighting the relationship as a battlefield. They're learning co-regulation, the ability to sync emotional energy with another person in a healthy way. This is not dependency. This is psychological maturity. It's the ability to be attuned to another person's emotions without being consumed by them. And when that shift happens, love becomes grounded instead of volatile. Think about that for a second. How many relationships fall apart because both people are trapped in emotional reactivity? One person explodes, the other defends. One panics, the other shuts down. The cycle repeats until communication dies. But when an avoidant begins to regulate, they break that cycle. They stop needing distance to feel safe. They begin to find safety in presence. You might notice small things, the way they start to take a deep breath before responding instead of snapping. The way they try to understand what you're feeling instead of invalidating it. The way they reach for you, not because they need to fix it, but because they finally know how to sit with emotion. That's a massive sign of love, because for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding emotion, learning to hold space for yours is the ultimate act of connection. And this isn't just emotional. There's a philosophical truth here. Love that lasts isn't about intensity, it's about balance. It's not about who feels more or who fights harder. It's about who learns to bring peace into the storm. When an avoidant starts mirroring your calm, they're embodying that truth. They're showing you that love can be steady without being dull, deep without being chaotic, and passionate without being painful. This shift often happens quietly. There's no announcement. One day you just realize they handle things differently. You bring up something sensitive, and instead of withdrawing, they say, "Okay, let's talk about it." You express emotion, and instead of shutting down, they listen. They may not always get it right, but the effort is consistent. That effort is their love language. It's not grand, but it's genuine. Psychologically, this is what healing looks like. Emotional regulation replacing avoidance. The avoidant begins to see that calm isn't weakness. That empathy doesn't mean losing themselves. They start valuing peace over control. They stop needing to win emotional battles and start wanting to understand emotional truths. And that transformation changes everything. You see, when you love someone who's avoidant, your own energy matters. Your calm becomes their mirror. Your groundedness becomes their guide. That doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It means you have to be aware. Because your emotional tone teaches their nervous system what safety feels like. And once they learn that, they begin to reflect it back to you. That's what emotional reciprocity looks like. It's the invisible heartbeat of a healthy relationship. And let's be real, this isn't an overnight change. They will still get triggered. They'll still need space sometimes. But the difference is they come back faster. They communicate clearer. They recover smoother. That's the rhythm of authentic love taking shape, calm, steady, deliberate. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that it doesn't just make them better partners. It makes them more whole. They start to see emotion not as a threat, but as information. They begin to understand that peace is not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. And once they learn that love stops being a battlefield and becomes a sanctuary. So if you notice that your avoidant partner is beginning to mirror your calm, don't underestimate what that means. It's not apathy. It's growth. It's them learning that love doesn't have to feel like losing control. It can feel like coming home, because real love isn't found in chaos. It's created through calm. And when an avoidant learns to mirror peace instead of fear, that's when love finally becomes safe enough to last. You know, one of the most fascinating shifts that happens when an avoidant truly falls in love is how they begin to redefine what independence means. For most of their lives, independence has been their armor, their escape hatch, their emotional insurance policy. It's how they've protected themselves from the vulnerability that comes with needing someone. To them, closeness often feels like surrender, and dependence feels like danger. But when they experience authentic love, something remarkable happens. Independence stops being about escape and starts becoming about freedom. Freedom within connection, not outside of it. This is one of the most misunderstood transformations in avoidant attachment. On the surface, it can look like they're still keeping their distance, still valuing their alone time, still holding on to their personal boundaries. But internally, the meaning of those boundaries shifts. Before, they were a defense mechanism. Now, they become a balanced expression of selfhood. They begin to understand that maintaining individuality doesn't mean rejecting intimacy. It means showing up as a whole person instead of a self-protective fragment. Psychologically, this is huge. It means they've moved from fear-based independence to love-based autonomy. Fear-based independence says, I can't rely on anyone because they'll hurt me. Love-based autonomy says, I can rely on myself and still choose to rely on you. That's the bridge between avoidance and security. That's where healing starts to show itself in real life. When an avoidant reaches this point, you'll notice they stop using space as a weapon. Before, needing distance was their way of maintaining control. It was how they avoided being consumed. But now, they take space consciously, not reactively. They communicate about it. They say, I just need some time to process, instead of disappearing. That's emotional maturity. They're not running anymore. They're regulating. They're learning that independence and intimacy can coexist without either one having to dominate. This shift also changes how they view love itself. They stop seeing love as something that will take away their identity. They start seeing it as something that supports it. That's the paradox of genuine love. It doesn't erase you. It expands you. For an avoidant, that realization is revolutionary. For the first time, they begin to understand that being connected doesn't mean losing control, and that loving someone deeply doesn't mean losing themselves. And this is where philosophy meets psychology. Because real freedom has never been about isolation. It's about choice. It's about being so grounded in who you are that you can choose to open your life to someone else without fear of being swallowed. That's what authentic love teaches the avoidant, that the truest form of independence is the ability to stay open, even when your instincts tell you to close off. You see, for the avoidant, the journey toward love is really a journey back to trust. Trust in themselves. Trust in their ability to handle connection. Trust that they can share space without disappearing in it. That's not something that comes easily. It's learned through consistent, safe experiences. Every moment they stay, every time they communicate instead of withdraw, every time they let you in a little more, they're rewriting their internal story. They're teaching their nervous system that love doesn't have to mean losing freedom. It can mean finding a new kind of freedom, one that exists inside partnership. And you can feel that shift in the energy between you. The relationship becomes lighter. There's less tension, less anxiety. They stop guarding their independence so fiercely because they're no longer afraid you'll take it away. They start sharing decisions. They start letting you support them, not because they can't do it alone, but because they finally realize they don't have to do it alone. That's love without fear. That's connection with choice. This is also where the relationship deepens emotionally and spiritually. Because when two people can love each other without trying to own each other, that's where real intimacy begins. It's not about merging into one person. It's about standing side by side, both whole, both free, both choosing to stay. And that's a rare kind of love, one built not on dependency, but on mutual respect and trust. If you've ever loved an avoidant, this is the version of them you were waiting to meet. The version that no longer sees love as a threat, but as a shared journey. The version that can say, I need space, and still make you feel secure. The version that stops running and starts reaching. Because in their heart, they've finally realized something they never believed before, that they can be both independent and in love at the same time. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson here, not just for avoidance, but for all of us. Love doesn't ask us to give up who we are. It asks us to become more of who we are and share that truth with someone brave enough to hold it. Because real independence isn't about being alone. It's about being free enough to stay. And when an avoidant learns that, love stops being a battlefield and becomes the safest place they've ever known.